My name's Tom Pearson. I work at Arup and I lead Arup's Heritage and Conservation Architecture team. So we do design for listed buildings and historic places of all kinds. I'm based in York, although my team is split between York and London. And I've been involved very heavily in Towns Fund and now with Delivery Associates. And I'll pass over to Katie, who can introduce herself and then take you through her slides.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everybody. I'm a director in Deloitte's real estate team, leading our internal heritage team. So working on projects across the country. I'm largely focused on large-scale regeneration projects, and I'm based in Manchester and have been working on the Delivery Associates network. So I apologise, I've got a cold today as well. So there we go, let's move on, the classic disclaimer. So as Tom said, I'm going to just run through a really high level overview, which I'm going to do quite quickly, but the slides will be available afterwards and we can pick up questions on the general sort of heritage framework we're working with. I did do a bit of digging on terms of who was signed up to attend today, and I note that we've got attendees from England, Scotland and Northern Ireland when I last checked. So I have sought to make this as applicable as for all of the nations. Tom and I largely work in England, so some of it is more focused on that, but the philosophy and framework is broadly the same across all the nations. And then, yeah, leaving time, Tom will cover the case study and then leaving time for discussion. So let's move straight on. So I like to start right at the beginning, and this is a sort of, as you're all signed up today, I'm sure you like heritage facts and information. So in terms of where our regime came from, it was actually for listed buildings driven out of, during World War II, the German High Command undertook what were called the Baedeker bombings, where they used tourist guides, the Baedeker guides that the Germans had, to target some of the cultural and historic sites to really try and break the morale of the British. And the government post these raids were quite concerned about our historic buildings and sites, and what local authorities were meant to do afterwards with these damaged sites. So they quickly started to pull together lists of historic buildings that they thought worthy of preservation. And as we all know, they used a grading system from 1 to 2 or A to C, which at the time, especially with the grade 1, 2-star and 2, as you might have clocked, mirrored the grading system that we receive our university degrees through as well. So moving swiftly on, the 60s, swinging 60s, they started to introduce a bit more control. So that's when you saw the introduction of the Civic Amenities Act, which was introduced conservation areas, which importantly are down for local authorities to designate, and also started and introduced the concept of listed building consent. And then moving up to present day, we've got the act that we work with, the 1990, or in Scotland, 1997 Act, and the wording in both of those is basically the same there. So requiring local authorities to compile, or the Secretary of State to compile a list of buildings, and importantly, it's any object or structure fixed to that building, and also within the curtilage. So we don't want to hear those words, which I'm sure we have all heard before, that it's just the facade that's listed. And as I mentioned, they were split into 3 categories. And this is where I'm hoping for some audience participation. But a very small number are of that highest category, grade 1 or category A. A slightly higher number at the grade 2 or B, and the majority were looking 2-star, sorry, and the majority were looking at our grade 2 or C. So any guesses for this building? I think we have an attendee from this local authority.
The Corn Exchange in Leeds.
Yeah, thank you very much. A fantastic building, and it's now been converted to a shopping precinct, but originally built in 1861 to 63. I think we've got a few attendees from this local authority. It's the kiosk. Yes, thank you. Yeah, yeah. I went there on a heritage gang trip with my friends several years ago, and we spent most of our time photographing the buildings and definitely not the animals. And then finally, I think we got an attendee from this local authority. This one's slightly hard, but this one is in Bradford. And there's numerous of these listed around the country. It's a K6 telephone box that was designed by Giles Gilbert Scott, who is well known for many buildings as well. So in terms of the framework we are working with, we just in terms of language that you might hear, we schedule ancient monuments, which is the oldest act that we're working with. We list buildings, no prizes for that first scheduled monument. And it's worth actually pointing out that sometimes buildings are also scheduled monuments and also listed buildings as well. But yeah, we list buildings. So this is the Bull Pub in Bracknell, which was one of my projects where the setting and context has greatly changed over the years. In terms of language, we register parks and gardens, battlefields. Does anybody know what this site might be? I think we have an attendee from this local authority. It's the site of the Battle of Hastings. And we designate conservation areas. So this was a conservation area I worked in a lot for the church commissioners. It covers the Hyde Park estate and was actually the second conservation area in the country to be designated. And then finally, we protect wrecks. And this is the Scarpa Flow wreck, which is 7 German high seas fleet ships and several war graves from World War II as well. So just focusing in on listed buildings, as that is the kind of largely the sort of main heritage asset that is commonly comes up in development and regeneration projects. So firstly, we've got you'll have a list entry for all listed buildings, and it will usually contain this, well, it should contain this information, but most importantly, it will have a listing description. But it's important to remember that this is just a description, so it cannot be used or shouldn't be used to decide what is only significant about the site. This is a classic example. So this is a grade 1 listed building in Manchester at the town hall, which is a fantastic building. And this is the extent of its listing description. So 3 lines. More modern listing descriptions are much more extensive and can perhaps be relied upon and will articulate the architectural and historical significance. But the older ones, you can't rely on them to really pinpoint the significant elements, and so a more detailed assessment will be needed. So what requires listed building consent? So the legislation is very specific about this, and it's a common misconception that listed building consent is just required for any works to listed buildings, but that's not what the legislation said. It's required for works which affect the character of that building as one of special architectural or historic interest, and we'll come back to that shortly. It's also, of course, worth remembering that any works that have an impact on the external appearance may also require planning permission. And as I mentioned earlier, if the building is listed, it's the entirety of that building and also any objects or structures that are attached as well, including potentially later extensions and buildings in the curtilage. And is there any doubt on this, it's worth getting an expert to do a review and assessment of this, because there can be things which can trip you up. The photo there is from Heaton Hall, and normally pictures hanging on the wall wouldn't be included in the listing, but this picture, it looks like it's hanging on the wall, but it's actually integral to the fabric of the building. So it was built into the interior decoration. So that would very much be part of the listing and be afforded the protection. So works that don't need consent. So conversely, and this is, supported by Historic England and Historic Environment Scotland's guidance on this, if the works are deemed not to affect the special character, then they shouldn't need consent. And examples of these, though Tom and I were having a discussion about this yesterday, works that are described as like for like generally don't need consent, but you can have a big debate over the definition of what like for like is. But generally, this is things like repairs, for instance, are a common one. And an exchange of correspondence can be used to confirm that with the local authority if there is doubt, or a more formal process of application to confirm. I've forgotten the title of the lawfulness of a certificate of lawfulness of proposed works. You can go down that more formal route as well. And there's an example there of a project I worked on where they were replacing these timbers in a railway warehouse structure, and it was agreed that these could be replaced on a like-for-like basis, and that was on the basis that the timber was specified and was the same as it is currently. So moving on, so in terms of determining what that special interest or significant, what is the architectural or historical character of the building is, to work out if you might be affecting it, and then if actually potentially you're causing any harm to it. In England, the term significance is used a lot, and this is the collective term, the sum of all the heritage values. It's important to remember that significance can be derived from a building setting as well. And there's various values that go into understanding that. So the two which are particularly relevant to listed buildings are historic and then architectural and artistic. Importantly, historic can also include a consideration of the meaning that communities derive from that place as well. And for some of you might remember that communal value was used quite commonly when conservation principles was introduced a few years back, but that's now largely been encompassed in an understanding of historic value. And then so historic value might be examples in terms of important events that happened at a place, and then architectural is a kind of much more easily understood in terms of the design and craftsmanship and construction that might have gone into there, and importantly, artistic as well. So, which is particularly relevant when thinking about the interiors of a building. So again, a bit more audience participation here. Does anybody know this building? And I think Dan has joined the call from Wirral Council.
Yeah, is it Ron's place, Oxton/Birkenhead?
Yes, it is indeed. Recently listed. Do you want? I've got the listing description here, but anything, Dan, you would like to say on this building in terms of its particular interest?
Well, I've never actually been. It predates my time at Wirral, but just being a local, there was a guy who lived in the house and just beavered away and did this by himself, and it became such an interesting site after he died that it got listed.
Yeah, so it's a sort of preeminent example in the UK of outsider art, which is the sort of later art movement of individuals, a lot of whom don't have any formal art training, and go on and do these fantastic sort of individual art projects, which sort of extend over many years. But this is largely listed for its architectural, specifically artistic interest. Another quick example about assessing that special interest. This one's slightly trickier, but is anybody from Lanarkshire Council with us today? Might not have joined, but this is the old Post Horn Hotel up in Crawford, and there's a much older listing description, so much shorter, so a bit harder to work out the interest, but from my review is largely listed because of its historical interest. So it was the 8th stop from London to Glasgow, accommodating a range of notable guests. And that link was an important connection of the major cities in the UK, emblematic of that sort of pre-railway era. Setting, it's just important to remember that this, I won't dwell on this, but this is a really important contributor potentially to significance, and it's quite a tricky one sometimes to understand, so it's always worth taking time to assess this properly. Just two quick examples here. You've got this grade 1 listed Rylands building in Manchester, and you can see the setting has very much changed here. And it's important to understand that change doesn't necessarily equal harm, and also that the setting can be tangible and intangible. So the setting of this building is as much about its immediate context, but also its location in Manchester as a preeminent industrial city, and that's the wealth that came out of that. As another tricky example, we've got the Science and Industry Museum, where the setting of all these listed buildings is understood as their immediate surrounds, but also you've got the railway line. So you could argue that the setting of these buildings encompasses their location specifically on this first passenger railway line. And then you could have a long debate about how far that extends as well. In terms of how to understand this significance, research is absolutely key. So if you yourself are undertaking an assessment of significance or special interest, or you're reviewing reports, these are the types of sources you would expect someone to have consulted. An example there is some work I did for the National Trust several years ago, looking at their archives before they've been catalogued, and I managed to find a Samuel Gregg, who established Quarrybank Mill. His diary had been sort of lost or not archived properly, and I found that again, and he was a very keen gardener, and it had a lot of insight into the historical importance of these glass houses. So when it comes to development proposals which affect heritage assets, listed buildings particularly, you've got to first understand that significance, and then understand whether we're causing any harm to that significance. And it's important here to remember that there are gradations of harm. In the English planning system, that's termed as less than substantial, and then substantial harm. In Scotland, the words significantly adverse are used, and the specific tests that must be used. Importantly, public benefits is one of them, and that can include heritage benefits, and securing the asset's optimum viable use for long term. And the more harm that's caused, the greater those benefits that outweigh the harm have to be. Which, simply put, we can kind of sort of summarize this process of working with heritage assets through the development and regeneration as first working out the impact on that heritage asset. So you're looking at that impact on that, specifically on the special interest significance, which should have first been worked out, and the scale of impact as well, and then working out how much harm is that actually causing. And then you should be going through an options process to try and minimize that harm. So this could be macro options, for example, where you're siting a building or putting a use, and down to micro options such as specific interventions to a window or accessibility, and have you explored how to minimize the options through technical design. And then looking at the public benefits that might be derived from the proposal and how they can outweigh any harm, or do they even outweigh any harm? And if they don't, can we either lessen the harm or increase the public benefits? And those in planning will be very familiar with the sort of terminology of social, economic, and environmental. And you can look to derive benefits in each of those. And very specifically, guidance encourages setting out the specific heritage benefits as well. For example, increasing the access to a heritage asset. And then just the sort of final slide before Tom sets out a case study. So in terms of that consenting process and the journey that you might need to take stakeholders on, and I'll touch upon some of the challenges we see as well. The first step is thinking about the vision that you're trying to deliver with that development or regeneration, and the site you've got. So what is that vision and why? What benefits is it going to bring, or are you solving a problem, and do you have evidence of that problem? And then importantly, when it comes to heritage assets, that site analysis needs to include that in-depth assessment of significance, so you understand the assets that you're dealing with. The next, and only once you've got agreement on that vision and the significance of those assets, should you really move on to the next stage with any stakeholder, is how are you going to achieve that vision? What quantum of floor space or quality of space is needed to achieve that vision? Is a specific piece of infrastructure needed? Is that the only way that you're going to achieve that vision? And once you have that agreement, you can then start to discuss the impact. And this is where that options testing really comes in. And it can result in extremely detailed optioneering work. There's a project I'm working on at the moment where we've got about 20 different criteria for options for intervention for a facade. So looking at U values, condensation, carbon, health and safety, structural, acoustic, having a really rigorous and in-depth assessment of some of these options when it comes to at the micro scale is really important evidence. And then once you've gone through that optioneering and your stakeholders can see the detailed evidence you're building up, you can then hopefully finally have your final proposal where you're left with your proposed development and a clear setting out of the public benefits and have the appropriate evidence to back that up. And I've set along the bottom sort of the key stakeholders that you're going to be taking along this journey. So you're probably going to start with the local authority and take them through each step, stage by stage. You'll then engage your, likely, if relevant, your national heritage body, whether that's Historic England or Historic Scotland or CADU, and again, take them through each stage of this journey with you, and do the same for the amenity societies, and then also the general public and other key stakeholders, like local interest groups. And one of the challenges that we see, and I've seen through the work in the DAN projects, is that sometimes people just jump from 1 all the way to 4, and they've missed out steps 2 and 3, and they haven't taken their stakeholders on that journey. And it's really important. I always think it's like going back and doing your GCSEs or your A levels. You've got to show your workings out to those key stakeholders who are going to ultimately be making a judgment on your application.